it's Emily Talerman here, and today we're going to be talking about understanding environmental policy resolutions. So one of the types of policy resolutions that you're going to see is environmental policy resolutions, where you're going to be debating whether or not we should be doing some sort of environmental practice. Now, they often seem really boring and difficult to understand, but I'll tell you that they're actually not very hard to debate. They essentially break down into the same core argument every time, whether or not you should be doing the environmental practice or you shouldn't. But you need to pay attention to how the resolution is worded, because even if you're arguing in favor of doing the environmental practice, that doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be on the affirmation. So you have to pay attention to how the resolution is worded. For today, I'm going to be using the resolution that my partner Tassine and I once faced, where it was, I'm kind of summarizing here, but it was something to the effect of the federal government should continue doing open pit mining, which if you don't know what open pit mining means, instead of when they normally mine rocks, they'll dig underground and use explosives to break open rocks. They just do it on the surface level of the ground. That's what that is. Now, here are the ways you can argue both sides. If you're arguing in favor of doing the environmental practice, that's typically the harder side to argue because you're likely arguing against something that's you're arguing in favor of something that's bad for the environment. But there are ways you can do it. The number one way I've seen people argue in favor of doing the environmental practice is that you're bringing in jobs. However, in this debate I mentioned with Tassine, the other team made this argument but provided no evidence that open pit mining created jobs for people that could not have otherwise be created somewhere else in the economy. So that argument for them fell flat. So if you're going to say that it creates jobs, you need to have data or evidence or logic to argue that point, because it's kind of the most substantial evidence you have. Now, I'll tell you a good piece of evidence for arguing that they provide jobs is that environmental practices can't be outsourced. It's not like a computer job. If you want to mine a specific mountain, for example, you can't send those jobs to China. You need people in America, like in that specific mountain, mining that mountain. So it's not something you can outsource, which means it is keeping jobs in America. Now, the other argument for claiming that you should do this environmental practice is that it is justified in the end because we need the resources from this environmental practice. Because the reality is we don't actually have sustainable resources for most people to live off of, so we unfortunately do need the resources. That's one way you can argue that it doesn't sound very positive, but it's very realistic. If you're looking for a very pragmatic approach to arguing, you can say this, that, as I was just saying, we don't actually live in this idyllic world where everyone's hippie and climate change is solved. We actually do need things like coal mining to function every day. If there was suddenly no coal, people wouldn't be able to function because we're not prepared for that. That's not the real world. So we do need the resources from whatever environmental practice you are debating about, because that's how people really live their life. Now, if you're arguing against doing the environmental practice, that's an easier debate usually. Which my partner Tassine and I were doing. We happened to be arguing against open pit mining. And I have to say it was a pretty easy argument. Obviously, you can say it's bad for the environment and talk about how climate change needs to be solved soon, yada, yada, yada. And you can also say that it's bad for human health. That argument kind of gets overlooked. People tend to just repeat climate change, climate change, climate change, but with forgetting that climate change also does have impact on human health. For example, I utilized emotional language by painting the picture of a mother and her child walking by ground that had been used for open pit mining and breathing in dust particles and getting sick because surface level mining just puts pollutants into the air. Now, see, that's another example of just a time taker on a pretty obvious argument that you shouldn't harm the environment. That was another more strategic way to argue instead of just repeating like climate change. That's another way you can argue against an environmental practice by saying that it's bad for people. And you can also, don't have to use such a specific level example. You can take it big picture, like lead poisoning in Flint, for example. That's another bigger example than just like the small example of two people walking by. You can really take it on any scale that doing these types of environmental practices are not only bad for climate change, but they're bad for human health. And I don't see this happening enough, where people connect the negative effects of climate change on the planet to human health by saying things like not having enough places to grow food is negatively impacting human health, that overall air quality affects human health, wildfires, natural disasters displace people from their homes. That's another argument you can make, that doing whatever the environmental practice is bad, not only because it causes climate change and is directly bad for human health, but that it causes climate change which is indirectly also bad for human health, in addition to being bad for the planet. Now, in the off chance that these arguments, whatever side you're on, are just not working, what you can always do is turn it into a debate about their policy. Now, whatever the affirmation is, if they have to argue, since it's a policy type resolution, they have to come up with a policy for how the government is going to do something. So in this case, you can argue about the merits of their policy and how it isn't maybe the best way to go about the resolution. Therefore, kind of taking off the pressure of your contentions about the resolution specifically and making it more about the policy. It's kind of a less interesting way to debate, and it gets kind of tedious and annoying if you're always making it about the policy, but that's a good tactic, and especially in these where you frequently end up repeating yourself that it's either bad for the environment or brings jobs. So that's another way you can kind of spice up these debates to keep them more interesting and give you more talking points. So saying things like, their policy isn't the best way to go about it, but our counter policy is, for example, are ways to debate about something that isn't directly the resolution and its contentions. But the most important thing you need to know about environmental policy resolutions is you gotta know what the environmental practice is. I myself have been in a debate with the other team, didn't really even know what we were talking about. They had no definition for what the environmental practice was. I think it was nuclear emissions or something. I can't remember what exactly the specific environmental practice was, but they did not understand it, meaning that they were not only not prepared to debate, but they had no real way of rebuttaling our arguments because they just didn't understand what we were even talking about in the first place, which it sounds obvious that you should know what you're talking about, but I've seen it so many times to where people don't actually understand what the environmental practice is. So where the other team will able to talk about it in more specific detail and why it's bad, like my story about people walking by and breathing bad air because it's directly on surface level. The other team didn't actually really know what open pit mining was. They told me after the debate, and you could definitely tell that that affected their ability to debate us because they weren't able to have anything to say about the specific details about open pit mining in that example. So that's why normally when you debate in person in your 20-minute prep, you are not allowed to use the internet, which is why debating with Wikipedia downloaded on your computer is so important. If you don't have Wikipedia downloaded, if we didn't have it, we would not have been able to know what open pit mining is because no one's ever heard of that. So make sure that you do download Wikipedia onto your computer for when we go back to tournaments in person. Now, this is a slightly quicker video, I would say. Or at least I hope it is. Now that I look at my clock, I don't think it is. But I'll now hold up my notes for you to make sure that you don't ever get stumped up by these environmental policies. So pause as you like. And I intend to have you guys practice some environmental policies just so you're familiar with them and don't ever get tripped up. But that saying, if you do have any questions, feel free to ask me or another experienced debater or, of course, Mr. Allen. And I will see you out there on the debate field.